We're back from our break now, and I might mention a couple of things we were talking about during the break when we were talking about the Romanesque and what did they all have in common. And somebody, actually our director, pointed out one of the things they had in common is these are the interiors that are very different, but they have a kind of cone-shaped tower on them, or spire, or roof. There's a Danish one. There's a little spire with a, he called it an upside-down snow cone. And well, this one doesn't, does it? But it has round Romanesque. And this one does. This one has the spires, snow cone shape. This one does. This one does. And that one does. And that one does. Okay. But our one student was absolutely right. They all have those Romanesque-shaped windows, which are rounded arches, and they're all that is the standard Romanesque windows. But again, you know, they're so different. They're so really different. And we were talking again about when you see, someone said, when you see a Gothic cathedral, you know instantly it's a Gothic cathedral, that it's a recognizable form. But I don't know that you would recognize these churches as Romanesque because they're so different from each other. And the 11th century is, and the early 12th is when these are built, and they have they're experimenting. They're trying different combinations of Roman forms to see what they like. And when we get to the Gothic churches, and see how different they all are, when we get to the Gothic churches, then they find a form, a combination that pleases them. And so then, now the Gothic churches are not all exactly alike. They're somewhat alike, but it's the basic form that pleases them. So what do you see here that you did not see on the Romanesque churches? What are the new forms that you see in the Gothic church? Anybody see anything new that we haven't seen before? Yeah.
There's patterns.
There are patterns, yes. Are you talking about the lines that sort of go vertically and horizontally? Yeah, we have that we really didn't see before. Anything else there that you see that we didn't see before? Yeah?
That one there, it kind of looks like it's more square than the other ones were.
It is more square. It's more uniform. You see something new?
All the arches have pointy tops, and there's like a focal point in the middle now.
Yeah, there's a focal point in the middle, and they have pointed arches. The pointed arches, and this is characteristic of the Gothic churches. And that's not an accident. It's not because they find it aesthetically pleasing, but it's a structural thing, because pointed arches are stronger than round arches. They can bear more weight. And the other thing that's different about these churches is they're much larger. And so they start, this is Notre Dame, which is the first cathedral. Before Notre Dame, Saint-Denis was an abbey church where Abbot Suger pulled together all of these elements into the pleasing form that we call Gothic. And then the first cathedral that was built was Notre Dame. And then the other cathedrals take their cue from Notre Dame. Another thing we might mention is the round rose window, which you can see is over the central door, the central portal, is the round rose window. And this is characteristic of a Gothic church. And it's this combination of elements that people found pleasing that they then replicated in various ways in the rest of the Gothic cathedrals. And to look at this geometric patterning again that you mentioned, which I think is really important here, the arcades across the front going horizontally, and then the piers that go vertically. This is characteristic of the Gothic church, that you can read the floor plan of the inside on the outside of the church. If you look at the outside, you can see, you can read what the plan is on the inside, that there are three sections to the church, and there are 3 stories to the church. And so this is articulated on the outside of the church. Now let's look at some others. Here is the back of it. Notre Dame in the east end. And what do you see new here that you didn't see in the Romanesque churches? Yeah.
The buttresses.
The flying buttresses. And again, this is a technological thing. You see, what they were trying to do with these churches was they were trying to build walls that were diaphanous, that walls that were skeleton walls that could let in the light into the cathedral, let the light come flooding into the cathedral. And in order to do that, they had to learn some new engineering skills. And one of those engineering skills was the pointed arches, which can bear more weight. And to bear even more weight, they put the flying buttresses on the outside to hold the walls up, because the walls are full of holes, okay, and the holes are filled with colored glass to let this holy light of God flood into the church through the colored glass. And here is the back side of Notre Dame Cathedral in the middle of the Seine River in Paris. It's very beautiful. And here you can see the characteristic of the Gothic church to be in the very center of the city. And so the Gothic churches are always cathedrals. The Romanesque churches were monasteries in the countryside, and the Gothic churches are cathedrals, and they dominate the whole city. And they're city churches, and they're the center of city life. So this is something else that's different about them. Here's Chartres Cathedral, the west front, and again you see those pointed Romanesque or Gothic arches, and then the rose window is really prominent on this one. And again you can see the three-story elevation and the division into a central nave and two side aisles. And you can see that articulated in the front and the towers on each end. Over the front door would be a tympanum of this kind. And the Gothic cathedral was envisioned as symbolic of the entire universe and all of world history, all the people, animals, the history of the entire world and the universe is articulated in the Gothic cathedral. The sculpture tells all of the stories of the Bible, and over the front door is the tympanum, and it's Christ. In this particular one is Christ with the symbols of the four evangelists in each corner surrounding Christ. There he is in a mandorla ruling the world. The apostles are in the arch above him, and or they're either below him or they're above him, and the Old Testament prophets surround him. And so this is the central event of all human history, is Christ, and the picture of him is over the front door. The Old Testament stories are all told from the creation through the Old Testament prophets, and the stories of the Bible are all told, and then the New Testament stories are told in the stained glass windows and in the sculpture. The cavity of the interior, and here we can see this over the tympanum, but and here is Christ as a jam figure, as the central figure in all of the world history, and the stories are told in the stained glass windows. Again, so you can read the whole history of the universe, and this includes modern or current events, so that you might have a picture of St. Louis in one of the cathedrals that he built, so that one of the stained glass windows might tell the story of the Song of Roland, or might tell the story of the First Crusade. It also, the stained glass windows or the sculpture can represent ancient philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, and current philosophers like Anselm and Aquinas, Peter Abelard. You can have current scholars that are there. can have symbolic figures like Lady Philosophy, or symbolic figures of justice, or the church and the synagogue. It can have, some of the stained glass windows were actually paid for and put together by merchants in the town, so that the Bakers Guild would have their own window, and the Carpenters Guild would have their own window. And so this would include all events in human history, including the people who lived in the city themselves. And so the Gothic Church contains the entire universe, all of God's universe, and it's reaching up toward heaven. Here's some more stained glass, so that this is an Old Testament prophet or a bishop. And in addition to the stained glass windows, if you approach the building as you go up to the doors, they're lined with what are called jam figures, which are figures that can be kings from the Old Testament, or they can be modern kings, or they can be prophets from the Bible, and including women and men, and all figures from history. So again, putting all of history into the cathedral. This is the baptismal font, and here you see warriors lining. The king is in the upper register in the middle, and then in the bottom you see warriors from the ordinary life. Okay. They're built to be as high as possible, soaring toward the heavens, because they're symbolic of the heavens. And in fact, I'm showing you black and white photographs because when you go into cathedrals today, they're all bare stone, but in the Middle Ages they were painted, and they were painted gorgeous colors, so that the columns might be painted red, bright red or blue, or those were their favorite colors. And the ceiling was dark blue with gold stars painted on it. And so all of these cathedrals were brightly colored, and this represents the dome of heaven. And each cathedral soared higher and higher, so that we have new cities in Europe. Remember, we have the growth of cities springing up all over Europe, and the cities rivaled each other to build the tallest cathedral. And so after Notre Dame, they got taller and taller and taller, until finally one of them fell down. But they built as high as they possibly could. These are we can't call them the world's first skyscrapers. The pyramids maybe were the first tall buildings, but these are the first tall buildings to be as tall as the pyramids. These gigantic cathedrals that soared up into the heavens, and they had these wonderful architectural and technological skills. Again, you can see the pointed arches that are holding up those stone ceilings, and imagine how heavy the stone ceilings are. And so the technology is the weight goes down on those ribs, and the columns hold the walls and the ceilings up. And so that's why you can put the stained glass windows in between those columns through the pierced walls. Here's Amiens, which soars ever higher and higher. And here is Nantes, again soaring higher, and you can see the ceiling with the crossed ribs. And here is Nantes on the side aisle. And here is Reims. Again, it's Gothic. You can recognize it as Gothic, but it has a different kind of character to it, and it's later in time. And one of the things you notice about Reims is, as time goes by and they build more cathedrals and they have this sort of standard form for them, they put more and more on them. So you can see how this one is really loaded with sculpture. They're decorating it with more and more icing, like a wedding cake. I mean, it becomes more and more elaborate, but you can see the rose window is becoming larger and larger too. Okay, and here's Arles, the portal figures on Arles, the sculpture becomes more and more elaborate, again telling the whole story of the world. It's very interesting. You can see the flying buttresses here. This is a bay of Amiens Cathedral on the left, and on the right you can see the bays of Malmesbury Abbey. And this is one of the innovations that they had in the cathedrals, is they built them section by section. Again, reason, system, and order. Everything in that cathedral was exactly proportional to everything else. The height of the wall, the height of each of the stories is proportional to every other story, and that height is proportional to the width of the nave and the width of the side aisle, so that they're a mathematical masterpiece. They're completely mathematically planned. And notice that on Malmesbury Abbey, on the right, you can see the bays, and each bay is identical to the other bay. And so they do this series of bays where they replicate it, and every one is identical to the rest. And building it in those units allows them to build it higher and again, reason, system, and order in a very systematic way. Here are some flying buttresses that hold the walls up. This is a double flying buttress, and it's even more sophisticated. That holds the walls up. And here is the ground plan, which again becomes more and more elaborate. It retains the cross shape and the cross shape of the early churches, but now it has some elaboration. If you can see on the top, it has chapels, a series of round chapels around the apse that people can walk around and see the individual chapels behind the altar. And so the floor plan is becoming more elaborate too. And here's Cologne Cathedral, which is built even later in Germany. It's a Gothic cathedral. You can see it's Gothic right away. And it becomes more and more elaborate. An elaboration of one reasoned and logical and systematic form. And those are the Gothic cathedrals. Okay, here are some sizes of the cathedrals. The Great Pyramid of Giza is 450 feet high, or 39.2 stories that you would have in a modern skyscraper. Amiens was 82,882.8 square feet, and it could hold 10,000 people within the Cathedral of Amiens. Beauvais, the vault, was 157.48 feet high. Beauvais is the one that fell down, but it didn't fall down because it was too high. I mean, they were trying to, every city was trying to build their church higher than every other city. Beauvais didn't fall down because it was too high. It fell down because they built it on the kind of gumbo soil that we have here in Houston, and so the foundation shifted, and that made it fall down. But there was nothing structurally wrong with it. It was the foundation that was bad, and that would have been 13.7 stories high. The spires on Chartres Cathedral were 344.5 feet high, which would make it 30 stories high. Strasbourg spire was 465.8 feet high. This would make it higher than the Great Pyramids in Egypt, 40 stories high. Cologne, 44.5 stories. And this is not surpassed until modern-day skyscrapers, when the Washington Monument, for example, is 48 stories high. So these are the skyscrapers of the Middle Ages, and no buildings to rival them were built until modern times and modern skyscrapers. There's a lot of other art being done. There's an explosion of art everywhere. Here's an example of some of the art, the Enameled Shrine of Limoges. Remember we said that the Germans were really, really good at metalwork? Well, they continue to be good at metalwork. They build shrines, they build reliquaries that hold relics, they build beautiful metalwork, little replicas of buildings and shrines that they put relics in, and here's an example of that. Ivory carving is another of the artistic techniques that are widespread. This is a beautiful ivory screen in Denmark, and you can see the beautiful carving that rivals Roman carving, the three-dimensional carving of Roman proportion, and the realistic kind of carving that shows the human body as it really is. But you can see it and you know it's medieval. I mean, you know it's not Roman. You know it's medieval because it has medieval characteristics. Here's a bishop's crozier, again with a beautiful carving in it. But you see this and you know, how do you know it's not Roman? I mean, it's lifelike, it's realistic, the human body is accurately rendered, the drapery of the clothing is accurate and realistic. How do you know it's not medieval? It's not Roman, but you know it's medieval. Anybody hazard a guess? I mean, it's Romanizing. It's Roman-like. It's realistic and lifelike and persuasive as a human form. But you can look at it and you know it's not Roman. What things about it make you know it's not Roman? Press your mic.
I mean, that one there kind of looks like it's coming out of a shadow, out of the dark, out of a kind of a corner or something. I don't know if that's common with Gothic or what.
Well, that was just sort of sitting in a niche. Yeah, it could be Roman or it could be medieval. Think back of the Roman art. I should have shown you some Roman art so you could see the differences. Well, for one thing, he's got clothes on. Most of the Roman statues are naked. Okay. And the clothing, the drapery of the clothing, it doesn't really show his body underneath realistically, and the Roman drapery would show the body very clearly. This is actually Christ, so that you would see he's got a cross, and so you would see that it's Christ. But you see it, and you know it's not Roman, and you know it's medieval right away for several of those reasons. There's a shift in Mentalite. What is Mentalite? It's the way we think about life, our orientation toward the world. It's the way we think about the world and how it operates. And so there's an enormous shift in the way people think about the world, the way they behave in the world, and the way they orient themselves in the world. And we can see this in the changes in art. Okay, this is an early medieval representation of Christ. This is in San Lorenzo in Rome. I think it is in Rome. It's in Italy. And this is the way Christ would have been shown in the early Middle Ages. He's shown as the ruler of the world. He's shown as the judge at the Last Judgment. He's shown as a ruling figure who judges and punishes. Okay, so here is Christ with his companions. Now, here is Christ as he's shown in the 12th century. So what is different? Yeah.
I guess it switches from showing him in the afterlife more to like what his life was like on Earth as a man.
It's showing him in human form. It's showing him as dying and dead on the cross. Remember when I showed you in early Christianity that Christ was always shown as alive on the cross, overcoming death. Now he's shown as dead on the cross. And this is a big change that happens in the 12th century. So he's being shown as human, as dying on the cross to save mankind. And this emphasizes, number one, his humanity, the fact that he was a human being, that he came to earth to live a human life, and that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. And so it represents the love of God as well as the humanity of Christ. It also represents the idea that man is made in God's image, And Christ, of course, took human form, and this is God's image and man's image. And also, man is perfectible and godlike. If man is made in God's image, he's perfectible and can reach perfection, and he is godlike if he is made in God's image. He is as beloved as a son or a daughter. And this is very important, and this might be important, Maria, to what you're talking about too in your paper, the idea that human beings are as sacred as God and are very valuable and beloved by God, so that they're of great value to God as well as to other human beings. It's humanism. It's what we think of in the Renaissance or in Greek and Roman times as humanism. And here we have God shown in as a man, as a human and perfectible man, perfected man, God being a perfected man, Christ. Okay, now the devil is shown in a different way. I'm sorry I'm not showing you a picture of the devil as he was portrayed in the early Middle Ages. How was the devil portrayed in the early Middle Ages? Anybody remember? In Roman times, who were devils? Who were considered devils? Anybody remember? The Roman gods, or the Egyptian gods, or any other gods who were not Jesus and the Christian God. All other gods, according to the Christians, were real, but they were devils, and they were shown realistically as real and powerful beings. Now we see the devil portrayed as a joke, and when he's portrayed as a joke and as a comic figure, this means he has no power. So it's the confidence in human power, in God's love for the world, that the devil has now become a joke, and God has triumphed over the devil. And so here he's shown as not real and as a joke. Now there's the third change that takes place in mentality is the change in the portrayal of the Virgin Mary. Okay? On the left is the early medieval image where she's shown as Christ-bearer, as the vessel that contains Christ. On the right, how is she shown? How is she shown on the right? Well, the answer is on the screen, of course, but she's shown as a loving mother, as a real woman, as a functioning woman, and the baby is shown as a real baby. Look at him touching her cheek in a very tender way, and she's a tender, loving mother. And so now the concept of justice changes in a really interesting way, because in the early Middle Ages I showed you Christ, who is appearing as the judge of the world, who rewards people who are good and punishes people who are bad. Now we have Mary as taking over some of the functions of this judgment, and she is the epitome of mercy, because who has more mercy than a mother for her children? And so she is seen as the ultimate mother. And so like a loving mother, Mary tempers justice with mercy, and she then becomes the intermediary between human beings and God. She becomes the intermediary, because who would a son listen to more than his own mother? So people appeal to the Virgin Mary. And here we see her portrayal as a loving mother and the epitome of all womanhood. Okay, and here is a beautiful University of Houston manuscript of the Virgin Mary in manuscript form as well as in sculptured form. Okay, now Christ and the Church are being portrayed as Jesus and Mary, or God and Mary. They are shown as, of course, bishops are married to the Church, and Jesus and Mary are shown as the Church, God and the Church being wedded together with Jesus and Mary in control. Mary is now seen as the Queen of Heaven, and the elevation of women is perceptible that with the elevation of the veneration of the Virgin, you see the veneration of women as sort of miniature versions of Mary, and she is the symbol of all womanhood. Another interesting development is in the language of the time. Christ is compared to a mother, and he is shown as being motherly and mother-like and fulfilling all the loving roles and nurturing and caretaking roles as a mother, so that people come to him as they would to a mother. And what this amounts to is the elevation of women and the elevation of motherhood and the role of women. It's in this environment that the courtly love literature arises, and courtly love literature arises in southern France with a group of people called troubadours. And they write love poetry that's set to music, and they go around and they sing it. And this is a phenomenon that's largely limited to southern France. It spreads to the north in different ways. There are trouvères in the north, and in the north of France you have the tradition of epic poetry like the Song of Roland, which is heroic, warlike poetry, and they meld together with, and in fact in the Song of Roland there are only two women, and they appear very briefly and in minor roles. But in southern France, the woman is glorified as the love object as the troubadours, but it's the kind of love object of unrequited love. So the women who are adored by the troubadours and worshipped are women who are married women, and the young knights who yearn after them are bachelor knights who are not married because they spend their early years wandering around. And this is part of the society of the Middle Ages. The women marry very young, men marry quite a bit at quite an older age because they have to make their fortune first. And so you see this sort of unrequited love between the bachelor knights who yearn for the perfect beauty of the married women and write love poetry to them. But it's love that is never requited. They're forever longing for their loved one, and the lady, by just her glance or her handkerchief or a look or a word, can confer nobility on the yearning young poet. We also see at this time the rise of Arthurian literature, which begins with the English writer Geoffrey of Monmouth, and what he does is to create a mythical history for England, an Anglo-Saxon history that didn't exist, that sort of rivals the Norman history that's being written with great energy at that time. He creates the stories of King Arthur and the Round Table and the Knights of the Round Table. In France, Chrétien de Troyes invents the romance novel, and this has to do with the rise of women. Chrétien de Troyes writes at the court of the French queen, and he writes to please the women of the court. And he writes novels, interestingly, about young love. It's about young lovers who are the same age, who fall in love with each other and want to be married, and sometimes they're tragic because they can't be married. But what it is the invention of teenage love, because everything that happens in these novels is the kind of thing you associate with young love. I mean, the lovers yearn for each other, and they're fainting for each other, and they can't sleep, and they can't eat, and they can't think about anything but their beloved. And so it's kind of the romance novel for the first time. This also has to do with the rise of women and the cult of the Virgin. At this time, and associated with the troubadours, is the rise of music and musical notation. And Gregorian chant is first written down. And one of the important things that happens is the music of the Middle Ages moves from monophony to polyphony. Okay. Monophony is one line of melody, and most music in the world is just one line of melody that goes along, and it can be accompanied by drum beats or something, but it's one single line. Once you can write music down, then you can see it, and you can see your line of music, and I've got the lines on the screen there, and you can make different lines of music in counterpoint to it. So you can have a slow-moving line of music with a harmonious line paralleling it a little lower, and then you can have a third line of music that jumps around and is real fast. And this is polyphonic music, and all Western music is based on the system of writing in the Middle Ages. All of our popular music right now is descended from this music that was written in the Middle Ages, the polyphonic music of having more than one line at one time. This was accompanied with new instruments, and this is largely because of the Crusades, that new instruments were brought in from the Middle East, and we see stringed instruments, for example, for the first time, and we see various variations of stringed instruments that come from the Middle East. I've shown you this before when we talked about Charlemagne and the writing down of music. It really kind of started in the period after Charlemagne's reign, but this is the first kind of written music, and you see it, and the music notes are written over the words, and you can't really sing that music because you have no guideline. All you know is that it goes up and down, but you don't know what note it is because there are no lines in the staff yet. They had to invent it, and so it goes along. It takes generations to perfect the writing down of music. So that's an early one. The troubadours in southern France were, for the most part, some of the spreaders of the first of this music and the popularizers of popular music of the Middle Ages. These troubadour love songs were the popular music, and they traveled all around southern France. Here are some of the main places where the troubadours went, and here is a troubadour who is writing music. You can see he's writing his music down on that parchment. And composing his music. And here are some more troubadours. These are German minnesingers who are also part of the movement of music throughout the high medieval world. And here is the epitome of the courtly love. Here is a lover and a knight and his lover in an allegorical scene, and the knight is adoring to the lady, and here we see the court of love. Ladies would, some of the queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie de France had courts of love where they would gather the ladies together, and novelists like Chrétien de Troyes would read them stories, and some of these women like Marie de France wrote the poetry themselves too. Marie de France wrote short stories that are still extant today. You can read them. And so the women are together at their court of love, which is a mirror image of the men's court, the king's court, with all his barons. So the queen and her ladies, or the baroness or countess and her ladies would form these courts of love. And here is one of them, and you can see all the musicians on the top register here and the lords and ladies down below. Here is a knight giving his heart to a lady, and she's stabbing it, but the knight gives his heart to a lady, and so this is the courtly love. But marriage then is except in the novels of Chrétien de Troyes, marriage is a business between men and women. It's an alliance between families, and it's not something that is done for the whims of emotion, but marriage is a serious business that's part of both the man's and the woman's duty to build the fortunes of the family through marriage alliances. And neither men nor women have much choice about who they're going to marry. Okay, the families arrange it all. And here are some women, some beautiful women who, in a tapestry, nevertheless, the High Middle Ages represents an elevation of the status of women. Okay. Here's the Code of Honor in chivalry. This is a joust, and the ladies are watching the joust from up above. An interesting thing happens to warfare in the time of the Middle Ages. It becomes very formalized and ritualized and almost a piece of theater. So that when these knights go to war, they don't go to war to kill people necessarily, although people do get killed. But it's more important to take people and hold them for ransom, because if you capture a prisoner, you get to keep his horse and his armor, which is very expensive and very valuable, and then you get to hold him for ransom, and his family will pay a fortune to get him back. And so it's much better to capture people at war than it is to kill them. And so battles have become kind of set pieces, almost like these jousts that you see. A joust is a kind of athletic event that where the young knights get out and they rival each other. It's almost a mock war, a mock combat, and at the same time, war is becoming more ritualized. And here you have a balcony with the ladies watching and the knights jousting for sport and for winning the ladies' favors. Okay. Here is Lancelot and Guinevere in the Tales of King Arthur. Again, he's giving his heart to the lady. And here is King Arthur and the Round Table, again created by Geoffrey of Monmouth as a hero of Old England and as a model for what people should aspire to. Polyphonic music, as I mentioned before, here's some more of that music, and again, they don't have a staff yet, and so it's hard to tell how you can see that the notes go up and down, but you don't know exactly what they are. This is the Song of the Foolish Virgins, taken from one of the mystery plays of the Wise and Foolish Virgins. The drama is born about this time as well. Drama started on the porches of the churches, acting out biblical stories, and as time went on, it became more and more elaborate until it's done actually in the theater, and I'll show you a theater in a moment. I want to show you some more of these musical manuscripts. This is a University of Houston manuscript. It's later, it's about 14th century, and you can see the actual staffs and the music here, so that this music you could actually sing or play because it's got the staff there that tells you what the notes are and how to sing them. Okay. Here is a University of Houston manuscript as well. This one is decorated with little musicians. Can you see the musician there? Anybody see where that musician is and what he's playing? Can you find the musician? This is a wonderful manuscript that we have in our rare books room. It's a really, really beautiful manuscript with little musicians. It's up in the left-hand corner there. You see him playing the harp, and then across from him is a wonderful, whimsical dragon. Okay. This is the best manuscript. I really love this one. Here you can see him. He's a little bit blurry, but there he is playing his harp in a close-up. And this manuscript is full of musical instruments. This one, okay, where's the musician here? Can you see him? It's down in the left-hand corner. And I know you can't guess what he's playing, so I'll tell you. But notice the little dogs at the bottom, and so we've got wonderful little animals all throughout this manuscript. And on the right is a lady who's watching. She's kind of the audience. But here's the musician, and he's playing the bagpipes, okay, which is a fine medieval instrument, the bagpipe player. Here are some more musicians playing chimes and guitars. Ancestor of the guitars, concert and musical instruments, and so music really takes off in the High Middle Ages. Here are two more musicians in Spain in the 11th century. This one is playing with a bow, and the other one has a kind of bird. I don't know what that bird is, but he's playing some kind of an instrument. Here is the early theater. At first, as I said, the theater plays took place on the porch of the church, where they were acted out, and then later on they moved inside the church, and they would be acted out as religious plays inside the church. And then as time moved on, getting into more of the 13th, 14th century, troops of actors would travel from town to town, and they would bring their stage with them and perform out in the open. And this is one of the early dramas that was done in the middle of the town. You can see the stage with the actors performing. In philosophy, we have a huge rebirth in philosophy. There are three great philosophers of the time that restore the vibrancy of philosophy. St. Anselm is usually credited with rediscovering logic, although actually there were a couple of people before him. He's the one who made it really popular and important. The works he wrote were Monologion and Proslogion and Cur Deus Homo. The Proslogion was a proof of the existence of God by reason and logic alone. The Cur Deus Homo was why man became God. And again, the use of reason for philosophy. Up until the time of St. Anselm, and he's 11th century, up until the time of St. Anselm, people proved things by quoting the Bible or quoting St. Augustine or quoting the Church Fathers, and that's how you proved something was true. With St. Anselm, you have the revival of the use of logic. Okay. Now, with Abelard, Peter Abelard, you now have the beginning of the next step. Abelard was a really interesting guy. All of these, Anselm and Abelard were teachers who taught. Anselm taught monks. Abelard taught in the cathedral schools of northern France, and he would travel around from one school to another, as all the teachers did, and they would, anytime a great teacher would come to town, students would flock to that city to study with him and hear him lecture. But Abelard took a step forward in the process. He wrote a book called Sic et Non. That means yes and no. And what he did was to pull out quotes from the Bible and from the Church Fathers that contradicted each other. For example, one place in the Bible it says, beat your swords into plowshares. In another place in the Bible it says, gird on your sword for Christ. Okay, which one should you do? Should you wield your sword for Christ, or should you beat it into a plowshare? And so he had a whole list of these things, a whole book full of these contradictions, Sic et Non. And that was the final exam for his students. They had to reconcile and come up with answers to which one is the right answer, which is the right one to do. He was a very popular teacher. Everybody loved him. But he had a very tragic life because he fell in love with one of his female students. And this is quite interesting that a lot of that women could be educated as well. But he was teaching a female student, Heloise, and he fell in love with her, and they had an affair. They eventually got married, and they had a son. And her uncle was extremely angry with him for having an affair with her, and so he was caught and castrated. And then he retired to a monastery, and she retired to a nunnery. It's a very tragic love story, and their letters to each other survive. And you have one of your readings is his story of his life, where he tells that story of what he does. The next person in the process is St. Thomas Aquinas. And what Aquinas wrote is the Summa Theologica, and this is an incredibly remarkable document, because what Aquinas started out with was the concept that a human being, that he could write in his book all human knowledge, that he could collect all human knowledge, and he could create a great logical system of an order all of human knowledge into one great network of facts. And he started with the basic question, does God exist? Okay. And he then had 4 answers to the question, does God exist? 4 different ways to prove the existence of God, A, B, C, and D. Okay, now he's proved that God exists, so then he wants to prove, does God act in the world? And so he has 4 different ways to prove that God acts in the world, and he builds, again, now, a whole pyramid of knowledge going from fact to fact to fact with the proof, with the questions and then the answers to them, collecting all human knowledge. Unfortunately, he was tried as a heretic at one point, but this doesn't take away from the greatness of what he proposed to do. But think about this for a minute, that he could conceive of knowing all human knowledge, and this is symbolic of what people thought about the capabilities of human beings, that one person could actually know all the knowledge in the world. So this is the growth of philosophy in the High Middle Ages, in the 12th century Renaissance. We see this progression from reason to argument to collecting all human knowledge. This was part of the rise of universities that happened at the time, the origins of our modern universities, as I said in the beginning of the classes. The universities grew around these professors who moved from town to town to town. They would go into a town and they would hire a lecture hall and they would advertise that they were going to have a series of lectures. And so students would come and they would pay to sit and hear the lectures of the great master, and they would be there for a time, and then they might move on, and there might be several masters in the town at the same time. The first universities were not buildings but guilds. The word universitas means everyone gathered together, and that is a guild. That is the origin of the name university, and it's a collection of people. It's not a building that it would be in. The word college comes from the word collegium, which means collection altogether, and the first collegia were actually like dormitory houses where the students would all get together and live together in a collegia. And again, this is a kind of union, a guild or a union. The first universities to locate in a city were Salerno. Salerno was the earliest university in southern Italy, and they focused on medicine, and they took a lot of their knowledge actually from Islamic medicine, but they became the great center of the dissemination of medicine. In Bologna, very early, the concentration was on law, and so Bologna was the most famous law university. In Paris, theology was the queen of the sciences, and so all the theologians gathered at the University of Paris. The university began in Bologna. Bologna is the first place where you see the university organizing. And what happened was the students were concerned about their rights of living, and they actually went on strike against the landlords who were oppressing them and charging them too high prices, and the people in the town who were charging them too much for food. And so they went on strike against them and wrote rules for them and forced them to be fair to the students. And then the students turned against their other enemies, the professors, and they wrote a set of rules for the professors. The professors had to hold classes on time. They had to follow their syllabus and give all the lectures. They had to end on time. They couldn't take a holiday in the middle of the lecture series without advance notice to the students. They had to hold all their classes, and they had to fulfill their contract to the students. So the first university in Bologna was actually set up by the students to control their rights against the townspeople and then against the professors. In Paris, you had a different development of the university. It was the professors who wrote the rules for the students, and it was that pattern that was adopted all over Europe. Most of the European universities followed the pattern of the University of Paris, where the professors wrote the rules and the students had to obey them. This is the origin of the degrees which we now have in our colleges. The young men who went to the university were called bachelors. They were all clerics who had taken minor orders, and they were called bachelors. Anybody who was granted a degree might become a magister, and magister means teacher, and from it comes our word master for master's degree. The higher professors were called doctors, and this is not a medical doctor. This doctor means teacher. And so all the professors were called doctors, and this is the origin of the granting of doctoral degrees. Why do we wear robes and caps and gowns when we go to our graduation? Well, because all of the students were monks and they wore monks' robes, so we put on monks' robes when we go to our graduation. And we go through a medieval ceremony to get our degrees. In the schools, they were taught, in the elementary schools, 3 subjects were taught: grammar, rhetoric, and arithmetic, and this was called the trivium. And so those were the basic source of knowledge: grammar and rhetoric and arithmetic, the foundational sets of knowledge. The higher subjects were music, astronomy, logic, and theology, and that's what was taught in the universities, and this is called the quadrivium. When these courses were taught, well, there were new monastic movements. I'll mention the new monastic movements, and then I'll talk about how the classes were taught. And I'm mentioning this because it was the new monastic movements, the friars who became the teachers eventually in the university. They started out with the Franciscans. They were called friars or little brothers, and they were mendicants. And they were not monks, but they kind of took holy orders, but they didn't go out and live in monasteries in the countryside like monks did. They lived in the towns, and they would preach on street corners, and they would beg on streets, and they were organized as a town movement. The main mendicants, and they're called mendicants because they begged for their food, but their mission was to preach to the townspeople, and the most famous branches were the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and they were the ones who became the major professors at the universities. Okay, and what was taught at the university were the classics, the early Christian fathers, and this is St. Jerome, and this again is another of our manuscripts at the University of Houston. St. Jerome, the writings of St. Jerome would be taught, the Roman classics, the Roman histories might be taught, the church fathers, Aristotle was eventually taught, but St. Augustine and Origen and the church fathers who taught in early Christian times would be the ones that would be taught in the universities. All of a sudden, they needed lots and lots of books. Books were enormously expensive. A book like this would cost a fortune to have a book like this. So now, when the universities were formed in the cities, new factories set up, copying factories, so people would sit and copy books. And when the students went into the classroom, well, these are astronomers that would be taught in the classroom, but when the students went into the classroom, at first they would go in and the professor would lecture, and the students would take down every word, and they would copy every word. The professor might read a whole book to the students, and they would copy them down. factories set up, book copying factories, where cheap books were copied and then sold to the students. And so you see a kind of explosion of what you might call publishing happening in the university cities. Here are some astronomers who are working on astronomy. Here are some mathematicians working on mathematics, and now we're getting into the 14th century or so. One is a mathematician who is looking at models, mathematical and geometrical models on the left, and on the right, the student is copying out a manuscript. Okay, here is an alchemist lab. That was their version of chemistry, and the main goal was to turn base metal into gold, but lots of other chemical processes were done in these alchemist labs. That is the foundation of modern chemistry. Here is a school, again with the teacher reading the book to the students, who are now copying it down in a very mechanical sort of way. And here is a later school where the professor is lecturing to the students and they're following it in their books. This is when they could actually purchase the books. The students had a unique culture all their own in the cities. They came in and they would live in dormitory-like colleges, and they would, some of them would sleep all day and not go to their classes and stay out all night partying, and we know about this through Goliardic poetry, which is Latin poetry written by these students that ritualized and parodied things like the Mass and the Lord's Prayer and all the rituals of the church. They would parody with this Goliardic poetry, and a lot of it was drinking songs, and they would go to the bar and they would drink all night, and they would drink a toast to the king and to all the barons in the court and to the queen, and the last toast would be to the Virgin Mary 20 toasts later. So there was lots of drunkenness along with these students. Gambling, they would gamble all the clothes off their back and all their money, and then they would write letters home to their father asking for money to pay their bills. And these letters survive, and one of the interesting things about these letters that was discovered by a historian some, 100 years ago almost, but he found that many of these letters were almost exactly alike. They were carbon copies of each other, and so he was able to track them down, and he figured out that professors were earning a little money on the side by writing these letters for the students to send home to their fathers asking for money. And their letters that say, oh, city life is so expensive, and I have to buy books, and I have to buy food and shoes, and everything is so difficult. I'm working so hard. Please send me some more money. And the professors were writing these letters and selling them. So that's city life. The students were divided into nations, whether they spoke French or German or English or Hungarian or Polish, or they came from all over Europe into Paris to study in the main university, and they were divided into nations according to their origin. And there were stories about these nations. For example, the Englishmen were said to have tails. And I'm sorry, I can't remember all the other strange things about these nations of students, but they were rivaled each other, and sometimes they had riots and wars from the different nations. But it was a riotous student life, and reminds you of some of the university life today, although maybe students are more serious today than they were then. But here's a school this is a 16th century university where the students are studying. Okay, here's a wonderful picture. This is a scribe who's copying a manuscript, and you can see that stand. The lion is holding up the stand where he's writing his manuscript, and he's copying it. And all the tools that the medieval scholar would need are there. All the pens and the inkwells. Can you see the inkwells, which are those little horns there? On the top of the book stand and on the right are the pens, the quills that they would write with. In his hand that's raised up, Hildebert is his name, In his hand is an eraser, which would be a pumice stone, where he would scrape the parchment, because of course they wrote on parchment, which was animal skins, and that's how you erase. You scrape the ink off to change it. And look at that little table there. Can you see what's on the table? Anybody? Not the one at the bottom, but the one on the right. It's a piece of cheese. And it's a mouse who's getting his cheese, and he's throwing his eraser at it. So the mouse is stealing his cheese. And then a little student is down at the very bottom doing an illumination or a picture for a manuscript. I really like that one. Okay, and these books are put into elaborate covers of this kind. This is for the more expensive books. This is a Danish jeweled and ivoried book cover. Books became very expensive, but they were becoming cheaper as they became more popular and more available. Here is the conferring of a doctorate, and as I said, the word doctor means teacher, the word magister or master means teacher, and so degrees that are given are degrees for teachers. And here is the angel that I'm using to symbolize the 12th century Renaissance. So we have a couple minutes left. If anybody has any questions or comments on the 12th, this is the Europe that we're going to look at, that bursts out of its boundaries and begins the connection of the whole world together. It's the explorers and discoverers from Europe that then go out across the Atlantic who connect the whole world together. And that's where we end the course in 1500, when all of the civilizations are connected together. So, any questions or comments about the 12th century Renaissance? Any questions or comments about the papers or the exams? You're all ready. Okay, then we'll stop a little bit early, and then and next week we'll have our last lecture, which will be on the Age of Discovery. Okay, see you next week.